Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to talk about Tom Perrotta's new book, Tracy Flick Can't Win. We'll also talk about his book Election because Tracy Flick Can't Win is a sequel to that book. Tom Perrotta is an author that I have read a lot of. I have read all of his books except for one. The only book of his I have not read is The Wishbones. I had said in my last Friday Reads video that Joe College is the one that I hadn't read. Turns out I was wrong. I looked online and it turns out I've rated Joe College. I just don't remember it at all. He's also an author I've been on a bit of a roller coaster with because I've really liked some of his books and other ones I've kind of passively enjoyed but also rolled my eyes a little bit. And then his last book, Mrs. Fletcher, is something I actively disliked. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that I ended my review of Mrs. Fletcher on my blog, which I will link down below if you would like to check it out, with this sentiment. I like Perrotta, believe it or not, but his instincts hold him back. He's written Mrs. Fletcher at least 3 times before, and better. It's high time to explore new ground. You can imagine then that when it was announced that his next book was going to be a sequel to Election, the 1998 novel that made him famous, I had very mixed feelings. Because on the one hand, it's the opposite of what I wanted. Instead of breaking new ground, Perrotta was literally running back to the past. And Tracy Flick is a really complicated character. Election is one of those cases where I think a film adaptation practically redefines how a property is received. When people talk about Tracy Flick, it's virtually guaranteed that they're not talking about the Tracy Flick you find in Tom Perrotta's book. Instead, they're talking about Reese Witherspoon as Tracy Flick in Alexander Payne's 1999 film adaptation. To be fair, they're pretty close. The movie is a lot more sharp and pointed and satirical than the book is. And the Tracy Flick you find in the movie is a product of that. So you really have to wonder which version of Tracy Flick is Tom Perrotta going to be revisiting in his new book. Now, on the other hand, Election is Tom Perrotta's most durable novel. Other works of his have been adapted before, most significantly Little Children and The Leftovers. By the way, Mrs. Fletcher, I believe, was adapted into a limited series, but I didn't watch it because, again, I didn't like the book. But none of those other adaptations captured the zeitgeist in the same way that Election did. And that means that Election, which is a slim novel told from multiple perspectives centering around a campaign for president of the student government at a New Jersey high school, has proven to be Perrotta's greatest success. However, one does wonder how much of Election's durability comes from the film adaptation. I'm not really going to get into that because it doesn't really suit our purposes today. And I'm not going to rewatch the movie, so I don't have any plans to really dive into it anytime. But I did reread this book before diving into Tracy Flick Can't Win. And I'd say it holds up surprisingly well, except when it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it's really not good. Obviously, when it comes to Tracy Flick Can't Win, my curiosity got the better of me, because if it didn't, why else would we be here? Now, just like Election was published in 1998, but set in 1992, so the student government election could run parallel to the presidential election of 1992. Tracy Flick Can't Win is being published in 2022, but it is set during 2018, so it can run parallel to the emergence of the Me Too movement. And just like Election, Tracy Flick Can't Win announces its mission statement in its very first chapter. To just briefly talk about Election, this one opens with Mr. M, who is a history teacher who runs the student government at this high school, explaining how much he enjoyed teaching, revealing by the end of the second paragraph that these musings are coming from a time and a place when he has been forced out of the career that he had always loved and wanted. Significantly, the example of the kind of discussion he liked to lead with his students is about 2 different things: moral character and the abuse of power. Here is a question that he poses to his students. How are private virtue and public responsibility intertwined? He then points them toward this conclusion. So don't the strong have a responsibility not to hurt or humiliate the weak? And that conclusion of his is quickly swatted down by a female student who cynically replies, Mr. M, she said helpfully, as if cluing me into the true nature of the world. That's not how it works. The strong take what they want. If election has any point of view on the quagmire that ensues with the student government election, it's that Mr. M is a hypocrite. He's introducing himself as an enlightened teacher who wanted to do right by his students, blissfully unaware that everything that he's saying exists in the shadow of his own disgrace. He desperately wants the reader to believe he's not the kind of guy who would do the despicable things that he's about to do over the next 200 pages of this book, and yet here we are. He did them of his own free will. He abused his position of authority in an attempt to hurt a female student. Even well-intentioned people do bad, hurtful things, and even afterward, they still want to believe that they are a good person at heart. If election has any staying power, it's that message right there. And I think one of the things that ultimately hurts Tracy Flick Can't Win is that it doesn't have anything that has that same level of impact. Perrotta's fiction is full of blissfully unaware man-children and flawed women who can't really see the forest for the trees. It's his wheelhouse. Election and Little Children are his best novels because they use this entitled obliviousness to the story's advantage. Mr. M is trying to make himself look like a conscientious teacher, and in the process, he's pointing directly at his own fatal flaw. He has no idea that he's done it, though, and that's interesting. And one of the things that was really interesting about rereading Election is that I can't remember if I've seen the movie or if I've just seen clips of the movie fairly nonstop for the last 20 years. But going back and rereading Election now, it really surprised me how little conviction it has. I think because the movie feels more pointed and satirical, it's easy to forget that the book does not actually have much of a point of view. It's sort of an empty shell that the reader can graft their own messaging onto. Perrotta presents the circumstances, but he doesn't do much of anything in the way of conclusions or telling you what you should do with any of the information that you've gathered in these 200 pages. And it's not that I don't think a book can do that. It can. It's just that it's surprising how little substance there is when you revisit this book. And that's actually lucky for Tom Perrotta, because the lack of perspective in Election is the only reason that he can go back and attach a sort of Me Too message to this earlier novel. We meet Tracy Flick here as she begins her run for president of the student body, which is a role that she has been working toward for years. No one really likes her or even knows her very well, but most people at least begrudgingly respect her hustle. And even her detractors have to admit that she would be the perfect president for the student body, and she would do a good job in the role if she were to get it. And I'm going to talk about this a little more before we pivot to Tracy Flick Can't Win a little more, because this is important for the setup of Tracy Flick Can't Win. The fact that Tracy had already had an affair with an English teacher by the time this book begins, and that English teacher was forced out of the school in disgrace, that's the storyline that aged the worst in this book. And it's significant because it's the one that Tracy Flick Can't Win depends on in its opening chapter. Part of why it didn't age well is that in Election, Perrotta is really desperate not to treat Tracy's affair with a teacher as if it was a big deal. He only wants to use it for two purposes. First, as the catalyst for Mr. M's quest to destroy Tracy. Mr. M was a friend with the teacher who was fired because of his affair with Tracy. And it's a rather gross way of sexualizing Tracy. Throughout the book, people comment on the great body that she has. Tracy is aware that she has a great body, and she kind of finds it amusing that people look at her. So having had this affair with the teacher enhances that quality of who she is. And again, because there isn't really much substance in this book, it's difficult to know what Tom Perrotta intends to do with any of it. And again, because he's so vague about what his intention with putting all of that is, he's able to adapt it for a different use in Tracy Flick Can't Win. I don't think he had the idea that it would progress in that direction in 1998. I don't think he was thinking about any of the issues that come up in the beginning of Tracy Flick Can't Win when he was writing it in this way in 1998 or 1997. Maybe I'm a bit naive about how people forgive men for things that they crucify women for, but I feel like it would be a much bigger deal for a teacher to have an affair with a student. And I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption to make. Mary Kay Letourneau was national headlines after she was arrested and put on trial for sleeping with an underage student in 1997. That's a year before this book was published. Now, sure, it's possible that a man in the same situation would not have become a source of national outrage, but it feels bizarre that it would have been all over the news while Perrotta was finishing writing this book and it was going to print. And instead of reckoning with the fallout of the teacher's affair in any way, Perrotta has the teacher disappear quietly from the school and go back to working in his family's hardware store. And in the opening of Tracy Flick Can't Win, we find out that he continued to work at that hardware store until it closed shortly before he died of aggressive prostate cancer at the age of 55. And that's right, even in the new novel, Tom Perrotta would rather kill off the problematic character than have to grapple with issues of consent or sexual assault. He'd rather just leave them hanging there and not touch it. And in Election, this idea that the affair was a fireable offense but not actually that much of a big deal is embodied by Tracy herself. She doesn't seem to care about what happened. Here are Tracy's very first words in the book Election. All right, so I slept with my English teacher and ruined his marriage. Crucify me. Send me to bad girl prison with Amy Fisher and make TV movies about my pathetic life. If I'd been on better terms with Mr. M, I could have explained to him that my punishment for sleeping with Jack was having to sleep with Jack. It pretty much cured me of the older man fantasy, let me tell you that. Except that it doesn't actually cure her of the older man fantasy, because in Tracy Flick Can't Win, we find out that Tracy had an affair with one of her married professors in grad school, but this time she got pregnant before the affair could fizzle, and that's why in Tracy Flick Can't Win, she has a 10 or 11-year-old daughter. So, weird life trajectory for Tracy Flick all around. Now, the next paragraph in Election pivots away from the whole affair to talk about the election as if Tracy is really bored of the topic and the election itself is her primary concern. In Election, Perrotta treats Tracy's affair with the teacher, as much as he treats it like anything, as a sign of her authority over herself. She's even unfazed that pretty much every male character in the book sexualizes her at some point, both with and without her consent. The way she sees it, she was interested in her teacher, so she kissed him. Then she gets tired of him as soon as she loses her virginity to him, so she ends it. She's so, quote unquote, practical about it that it's not even her fault that the affair is discovered at all and that the teacher is fired and ends up in disgrace. The affair only comes to light because the teacher was so desperate to continue the affair that he wrote Tracy a note on one of her essays, and her mom found the essay, read the note, talked to Tracy, and then Tracy admitted things. They went to the principal, and the next day the teacher was gone. That's the only reason the teacher ends up fired in the book Election. Later on, when Tracy does actually describe the arc of her relationship with this teacher, she puts this down to a character flaw on the teacher's part. Quote, I feel bad for him, but I don't feel guilty. He was the adult. If he hadn't acted like such a baby, everything would have been okay. Here's how Tracy opens that description of her relationship with her teacher. People use the term sexual harassment to describe what happened, but I don't think it applies. Jack never said anything disgusting, and he never threatened me with bad grades. Most of our time together was really sweet and nice. I even cried a few times. It felt so good to have him hold me. So ironically, in order to make the Me Too reappraisal of Tracy Flick work, Perrotta has to undo his previous work to make it look like it wasn't such a big deal. And again, I don't think you can say that Tom Perrotta had this intention in Election. It looks like he gave himself the room to come back and apply the Me Too way of thinking to Election by not really having any conviction about what was going on with the affair with Tracy in the first place. Ultimately, all that matters is that Tracy Flick Can't Win opens with Tracy in 2018 reading newspaper articles about the Me Too movement and simultaneously refusing to believe that her own story fits this narrative, kind of like she was doing in that paragraph about sexual harassment in Election. And then she wonders if the affair with the teacher actually impacted the entire course of her life in profound ways that she hadn't really noticed before, or maybe she was in denial about how much it had impacted her life. The problem is that then Perrotta forgets about that idea for about the next 60 to 70% of Tracy Flick Can't Win. When he finally does circle back to it, he only does so glancingly. So instead of grappling with the question of what the male gaze has done to her life, Me Too is just a MacGuffin that allows Perrotta to re-enter Tracy's world. It's almost like he felt like he wanted to go back to Tracy, but he couldn't unless he found a way to justify all of that stuff, but he still doesn't actually want to deal with it. So he kind of introduces it and then immediately drops it like a hot stone that he just doesn't want to touch. And ultimately, instead of exploring where Tracy's life would have gone, Tracy Flick Can't Win is essentially a rehash of Election, but set in the adult world. Instead of running for student government like she was here, Tracy is interviewing to be principal at a school where she has been tirelessly slaving away as the assistant principal for years. And while Tracy is the most qualified person for the job, people keep looking for other potential candidates who would not be as good in the role as she would, just like Election. Now, never mind that this really just does not feel like the life trajectory Tracy Flick would have been on in Election. For the sake of a sequel that has a very parallel plot, Perrotta has to finagle her story so she'll be back in a high school running for a position the world would deny her of, even though she's the best person for it. I guess to Perrotta, it wouldn't have been interesting to check in on Tracy Flick if she had become a lawyer or a politician, as Election had kind of promised that she would. At the end of this book, she goes off to Georgetown to pursue a political career. Now, Perrotta does make casual references to how Tracy ended up on the life path we see her on in Tracy Flick Can't Win as the novel progresses, but they feel hollow. As soon as you pick at them, they fall apart. It doesn't really make sense. And this is not really a spoiler. Her mother gets sick, so she leaves Georgetown to take care of her mother. Cool. That would be a nice thing. And it actually deepens the relationship with her mother that's only really glanced at in Election. However, there are schools around her high school that she could have transferred to. Leaving school to take care of her mother doesn't mean she had to give up her ambition in life. But Tom Perrotta seems to think that it does. And that's not the only thing that sidelines her, but that just exemplifies to me the idea that, like, okay, he's giving you an example, but the second you really think about it, it just doesn't hold up. Like, even Rutgers is like right there around the place where she went to high school. She easily could have continued her college career and stayed on the track that she was on and not sacrificed anything. But Tom Perrotta wants you to think that this was just the way her life turned out, and isn't it a shame? So ultimately, what is the purpose of this sequel? It doesn't really have one. Perrotta doesn't have anything interesting or novel to say about his Election 2.0, so it just kind of lingers. The structure doesn't really work because there are too many perspectives to make it come to anything coherent. And he tries to be playful about that as well, because he has a character at one point complain about a book that they're reading, that there are so many different perspectives that they don't know what to think anymore. Ha ha, Tom Perrotta. It really doesn't help that none of the new characters feel interesting or memorable at all. You could easily eliminate some of the narrators and not lose a single thing from the book. In fact, some of the narrators actively make the story worse because they feel like desperate reaches for something relevant or topical or youth appropriate. For instance, there are two high school students, the president and the vice president of the Student Government Association, who are involved in the plot of this book, and you could just easily remove both of them. The male high school student becomes infatuated with an alumni of the high school who does ASMR on social media, and the female high school student is dating a non-binary person. Ultimately, none of that matters. Again, you could just delete their passages of the story from it completely, and the book would be just fine. And for some reason, some of these perspectives are told in the first-person narration, and some of them are not, and it doesn't really make sense which ones are and which ones aren't. and transitioning from one to the other feels jarring for no good reason. By the way, I haven't really mentioned the plot except to say that it's very similar to Election. So Tracy is running for principal of the school, and the complicating factor is that the head of the school board is this rich guy who is meant to sort of embody the way rich people throw around their money, saying that they intend to do good things for the community, but they're actually really just trying to get what they want. So he wants to bring the glory back to his previous high school by starting a high school hall of fame. And Tracy's involvement in this process is one of the complicating factors in her candidacy for principal of the school. And the reason those two students are involved is that as the president and vice president of the student government, they are invited to sit on the committee that will decide who is going to be selected to the Hall of Fame for this year. And of course, because Tom Perrotta loves screw up former football player type guys, there's a screw up former football player in the book. And I'm so tired of it. Now, you could make comparisons between Tracy Flick and Hillary Clinton. It seems to be that Tom Perrotta is hoping that you will read Tracy Flick Can't Win and do just that. After all, Tracy is an ambitious woman, eminently qualified for big jobs, who everyone despises for those very same character traits. It's just that you could already see Elections Tracy Flick as a stand-in for Hillary Clinton. In fact, that's a better comparison since this novel is already set in an election where Tracy's big competition is a male student whose lack of qualifications is rendered null by his popularity. That would be more interesting. And again, while Perrotta seems to be inviting you to make the comparison between Tracy and Hillary, he doesn't seem interested in really doing anything to make an actual point about what any of that would mean. I mentioned another problem with Perrotta in my review of Mrs. Fletcher, which is that too often the plot derails the direction his characters were going in, but by the end, everything is mostly back to normal. For instance, in a lot of his novels, somebody starts to throw out their life by having an affair, and it derails them off the course of their life, but then at the end, the affair ends and they end up exactly back where they were. Sometimes that's really poignant and meaningful, like Little Children. Sometimes it's just like, what was the purpose of everything I just read? And in Tracy Flick Can't Win, it feels like the latter. I guess the refreshing thing about Tracy Flick Can't Win is that in most Tom Perrotta novels, like I said, their characters are self-destructing. Tracy Flick is not self-destructing. She is being acted upon by other people and the decisions that they are making. And that is kind of refreshing. Usually that is not the case in Tom Perrotta books. But it still feels odd that by the time we get to the end, things are mostly on their original trajectory. No real spoilers there. I have seen some early reviews talk about the fact that the ending of the book is actually fairly dark, and that's a bit of a surprise. Kind of. I feel like the ending is telegraphed by the halfway point of the book to the point that it's not actually that much of a surprise. And I think Tom Perrotta has a history of doing dark things in his book, as anybody who has read Little Children can attest. Even The Leftovers has a pretty dark ending. So it's not all that surprising. It just doesn't really do anything either to make that dark ending feel poignant or revelatory or like anything that happened in the book has meaning or substance. You just start to wonder what the point was. The biggest problem is that ultimately Perrotta can't make a compelling case for why we had to revisit Tracy Flick at all. It's a perfectly fine book. It reads quickly, but it doesn't do anything to justify its own existence. Maybe that's an unfair criteria for a book. Certainly it's something we only ever think of when it comes to sequels. We don't think of it for standalone books. But I think it really applies here because Perrotta has twisted so much of the book to make it an extension of Election, to make the plot run parallel to Election. So you really do have to wonder if Tracy Flick Can't Win justifies its own existence. And I just don't think it does. And Not that I want to accuse anybody of trying to be a little bit craven or grasping for something, but the very fact that Tracy Flick's name appears in the title of this book like a beacon for readers means that both Perrotta and the publisher are banking on name recognition from audiences to spark interest. And it's probably not a mistake that the version of Tracy that is on the current jacket of Election, I'll put the photo of it right here for a second, looks unmistakably like Reese Witherspoon. It's relying on the familiar to get you interested or to get you invested in the story. And then it has nothing truly new or interesting to offer you in return. And I think that is the problem with Tracy Flick Can't Win, and some of the problems with Election. Tracy Flick Can't Win will be published on June 7th, 2022. If you have read it, I'd love to hear what you've said. If you're finding this review after you have read the book, or if you're gonna hold on it until you've read the book, let me know what you thought. Try to avoid spoilers. I talked glancingly about the ending, not too spoilery. You can certainly read this book with everything that I've said and not have anything ruined for you, I think. But let me know what you think in the comment section of this book down below. If you've read other Tom Perrotta books, if you've read Election, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm very curious because he's an author I've been on a roller coaster with for a very long time. So I'd love to hear what somebody else thinks. I feel like it's at the point now where, because I've read all but one of his books, I feel like I need to be a completist, but I'm also not really enjoying them anymore. So maybe I just need to cut the cord. And then the question is, when do you cut the cord? And I don't really have an answer for that. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.